Welcome to Wagner Part 2. I want to move on to Tannhauser. Tannhauser, I don't think is quite as good as Flying Dutchman from a dramatic standpoint, but it has an incredibly good overture. It's one of Wagner's best. And the overture really tells the story, or at least it lays out the dramatic conflict. And I want to talk a little bit about how Wagner reuses musical material, because this is an extremely important feature of Wagner's work, and I think it's more subtle than most people assume. Wagner in these German Romantic operas of the 1840s does not really embrace fully what becomes the leitmotif uh, network or system that he uses for his later work. But you do get themes that are important musically and dramatically established in an overture and used throughout the opera at important points. So it's much more extensive use than the thematic reminiscence that we encountered in Italian and French operas of the 19th century. Wagner essentially explains how he does it in an article he wrote back in Paris when he was working on The Flying Dutchman. You can see the quote here. So, and go through and please listen closely. So the overture, the opening theme establishes the notion of sacred love, and it's the Pilgrim's Hymn. The second theme, contrasting, is the conflict, profane love. Wagner's music for the Venusberg and Venus, the Queen of Love, who Tannhauser spends a year with at the beginning before feeling remorse and wanting to come back to his more spiritual love for Elizabeth. Of course, he's sinned, and he has to ask forgiveness and penitent. He makes the pilgrimage to Rome. So, hence the return of the Pilgrim's Hymn, but this time more richly scored. So, worth listening to. It's a wonderful piece. And lays out dramatically and musically the drama that you're about to hear. Another thing I wanted to look at closely in Tannhauser is a new way of setting text that Wagner develops in the last act, specifically Tannhauser's Rome narrative. He, to prove himself worthy of Elizabeth, he has to go to Rome, to the Pope, to ask for forgiveness. And he describes, after he's gone through this journey, an ordeal, he describes it to his friend Wolfram. It's over 10-minute scene. The Wagner setting is neither aria nor is it recitative, and it's not really accompanied recitative either. It's what is described as Sprechgesang, which is something different than recitative. It's more deliberate setting than anything that's a true recitative in the Italian style. And it has lyric song in it, but it is not organized structurally like a song or an aria. It doesn't have verses. It has recurring music in the orchestra, but the singer doesn't really come back to recurring ideas. So it's really something quite different. So that's why they have a different name for it, and it's characteristic of German opera. You don't really encounter such a thing in Italian opera. So please follow that through. That's a style that will be taken up and developed to some extent in his later music dramas. Okay, so Tannhauser was a success in 1845. 1848, Wagner was working on a new opera, Lohengrin. And as you may remember from the Italian unit, 1848 was a big year in Europe, throughout Europe. Revolutions in Paris, movements for independence in Italy, nationalist movements developing, and Germany is no different. Now, Dresden, where Wagner is, was slow to catch on to this revolutionary fervor, but it was building, and it burst through in May of 1849. And Wagner was really at the center of the agitation. And the the revolution was put down brutally by the Saxon king with help from the Prussians. Many people were arrested and many others fled, and Wagner was one of them. A warrant was put out for his arrest, and he could not return to this part of Germany and really any of the German-speaking lands because they all recognized each other's warrants. So he really was cut off, and he would be so completely for 12 years. So Lohengrin, which had to be conducted by Liszt, his Wagner's friend, in his absence in Weimar. So where did Wagner go? He went to Switzerland, and there he spent the next 12 years. He was cut off financially, so he had to really live off friends during this time. He did have some work, but of course he couldn't work in any German cities. So it was an extremely difficult time. And for about the first 4 years, he really did not compose. He took the opportunity to rethink. I think he was inspired by revolutionary zeal, and he truly embraced a revolutionary approach to music. He wanted to completely reform opera. And this is what a lot of his essays are devoted to. And he lays out a vision for a new style of opera, which is so dramatically different from him that he doesn't even want to call it opera. He calls it just dramas or music dramas. These would be characterized by an entirely fluid dramaturgy that does not divide the music up into separate numbers. Certainly no arias, certainly no dry recitative, not even separate duets and trios. It's really, the technique develops is called endless melody. Entirely fluid. Now, to give some structure to this, to structure it, instead of it using conventional numbers, he develops a network of leitmotifs. Now, this is not just an important 2 or 3 themes that come back. This is an entire network of what can be dozens of themes, particularly for longer works like the Ring Cycle. So I have these relatively short, some are a little longer, but there are a whole variety of musical ideas, short and long, harmonic, rhythmic, and melodic, all associated with different, it can be specific ideas, it can be very general, abstract ideas. But it's a network, and everything in the opera, all the music, is interwoven by these motives. And that means, from Wagner's standpoint, everything is interwoven in these dramatic ideas, because the important thing the way to think about a leitmotif is that it's a motivation. It's a musical idea associated with a dramatic motivation. So the music is the drama. And then the other big idea is the idea of the Gesamtkunstwerk, the total work of art, unifying everything. Music, song, drama, poetry. Wagner, of course, wrote his own librettos. He also was extremely explicit about how the stages works. He had ideas about all the scenery. Everything was part of a unified vision. Now, these high aesthetic goals were just part of what he was writing. He also wrote some quite ugly essays, one particular called Jewishness in Music, and it is an attack on specifically Heine and the German poet Heine and Meyerbeer, the composer, who had been his mentor, but really an attack on all Jews in art. His basic point is that Jews, because they're essentially an alien element, can never really express the heart of any culture, much less German culture, because they don't really have a culture. This essay was first published anonymously. He later put his name on it and openly admitted it. This is the ugly side of Wagner, which I will ask you to think about as we do a discussion board later. Now, During this time, Wagner as I said, he relied on a lot of help from friends and supporters. One supporter was Otto Wesendonck, who basically built Wagner a home on his estate and allowed him to live there and paid him. Wagner repaid the favor by becoming infatuated with the man's wife. And Matilda Wesendonck, whether they had an affair or not, it's never really been proven. It's not particularly important, but Wagner was completely infatuated with her. He wrote love letters. He set her text into 5 songs called the Wesendonck Lieder, and also this affair that she was not going to leave her husband for him. So it was never going to be fulfilled and realized in the form of marriage. It drove him to, inspired him to work on his opera Tristan und Isolde, which is about this idea of a love, a forbidden love that can't it can't be realized in this world. It was for Wagner really how all true love is. All true love is unrealizable. Extremely romantic notion, and Tristan and Isolde is the most pure expression of this romantic ideal. It's also the purest expression of Wagner's a technique of endless melody, and I take you through that in considerable detail, so please listen up to that and read closely. Another important, beyond that musical technique, is a concept that I think is elusive. It's difficult to wrap your head around, and this is the idea of the love-death. The famous final aria of the opera is called the Liebestod, love-death, and the idea that love and death are essentially the one and the same. That pure love can find its fulfillment only in death. So read carefully. Wagner's getting these ideas. It's a philosophical concept, and he's been reading a lot of Schopenhauer, and it has some resonances with Eastern thought that sort of you become a oneness and obliteration of the self in giving yourself over to a oneness with the universe. And so this idea of the characters of Tristan and Isolde, literally, they sort of negate themselves. They become fused. And there's one remarkable moment in the love duet at the end of in the middle of Act 2, just before they're caught, in which the characters trade names. Tristan says, "I am Isolde, you are Tristan." Isolde repeats, "I am Tristan, you are Isolde." Their identities are melded, and this is Wagner's the ideal spiritual love requires a self-negation. So spend some time with that. That is not an easy idea, and it's been subject to a lot of misunderstanding and a degree of ridicule. But it's a serious idea, and it's given some credence later by psychologists like Freud.